American Politics Today, Chapter 12, The Bureaucracy. What's with all this red tape? Government. 3/4 parasitic and the other fourth stupid fumbling. Robert E. Heinlein, American writer. Bureaucracy is not an obstacle to democracy, but an inevitable complement to it. Joseph A. Chpt, American economist. Throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, one of the most important pieces of information was the number of people who died each day from the disease. Death statistics captured not only changes in how many people were suffering from the virus, but also our success at treating these cases. At the same time, death statistics were politically significant as they were a visible indicator of government's effectiveness at dealing with the pandemic, particularly in the earliest affected states. Sharp increases in the number of daily COVID-related deaths highlighted gaps in state and local government preparedness, including a lack of protective equipment and other medical supplies. A reluctance to impose lockdown measures, and an overall unwillingness to take the problem seriously. The political significance of death statistics was one reason for ongoing debate within the federal government over measuring COVID-related deaths. For example, if a patient with a compromised immune system caught the virus and died, was the death due to COVID-19 or the underlying condition that increased the person's vulnerability? Scientists at the Federal Centers for Disease Control and Prevention wanted to ignore underlying conditions, while members of President Trump's staff favored excluding cases from the pandemic's mortality statistics if an underlying condition could be identified. This example highlights three essential features of the federal bureaucracy. First, bureaucrats are often engaged in highly technical tasks that require expertise and judgment. Second, these tasks have political consequences for President Trump. A reduction in death statistics would have helped him argue during the 2020 election campaign that his administration had responded effectively to the pandemic. Third, while Trump wields considerable power as president, he cannot simply order bureaucrats to do whatever he wants. Throughout his time as president, Trump described the bureaucracy as more or less autonomous deep state, raising the I'll go ahead and zoom on that. Raising the question whether bureaucratic actions reflect expertise or a political agenda. In this case, opposition to Trump's re-election. Up to now, we've decided that the policy-making process in these terms in 3 steps. Number 1, citizens elect representatives. Number 2, the representatives go to Washington and enact laws. And 3, bureaucrats are given these laws to implement the reality in our system is that the responsibility for implementing laws conveys policy-making power. When bureaucrats write regulations, sign contracts with private corporations, deliver services to citizens, or make judgments about how to measure things like deaths due to COVID-19, they are translating often vague statutes into concrete decisions. Moreover, because of their training and experience, bureaucrats are often better informed than elected officials about the details of government policy. Bureaucratic expertise creates a new problem for elected officials. If they ignore what bureaucrats tell them or force bureaucrats to implement laws and directives as written, the result may be policy failures. However, if elected officials acknowledge that bureaucrats are experts and allow them to make as well as implement government policy, elected officials in effect give up all their power to bureaucracy, something that Trump administration was unwilling to risk. Were bureaucrats really obstructing the Trump agenda, or were they just doing their jobs? How do elected officials control a bureaucracy of experts in the midst of a pandemic or in more routine times? I'll go ahead and do that because these are key terms. What is federal bureaucracy? The federal bureaucracy is a vast network of agencies that make up government's executive branch. It is composed of millions of civil servants who work for the government in permanent positions and thousands of political appointees who hold short-term, usually senior positions, and are appointed by an elected leader, such as the president. Another name for the bureaucracy is the administrative state. In general, the job of the federal bureaucracy includes a wide range of tasks, from regulating the behavior of individuals and corporations to buying everything from pencils to jet fighters. These activities are inherently political and often conflictual ordinary citizens. Elected officials and bureaucrats themselves often disagree about aspects of these activities, and they work to influence bureaucratic actions to suit their policy goals. What do bureaucrats do? The task of the bureaucracy is to develop and implement policies established by congressional acts or presidential decisions. Sometimes the tasks are very specific. For example, in the appropriations bill for fiscal year 2020, Congress mandated that the Navy purchase 98 F-35 attack fighters from defense contractor Lockheed Martin. This provision required no discretion on the part of the bureaucrats who were tasked to implement it. All they needed to do was sign the contract, make sure that the jets were delivered, and pay Lockheed Martin. More commonly, however, legislation provides only general guidelines for meeting governmental goals. Bureaucrats thus have considerable latitude to develop particular policies and programs. For example, the 1938 Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act gave the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, the job of determining which drugs are safe and effective, including drugs to treat COVID-19, symptoms, and vaccines to prevent people from getting the disease, but it allowed FDA bureaucrats to develop their own procedures for making these determinations. Developing regulation. A regulation is a rule that allows the government to exercise control over individuals and corporations by allowing or prohibiting behavior, setting out the conditions under which certain behaviors can occur, or assessing costs or granting benefits based on behavior. Bureaucrats gain the authority to write regulations and act or granting benefits based on behavior. Bureaucrats gain the authority to write regulations from acts passed by Congress, either through the state that initially sets up their agency or through subsequent laws. For example, the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, has many regulations that limit the amount of various pollutants that can be emitted from factories, automobiles, and electrical power plants. The EPA's authority to develop these regulations, as well as limit on other power plant emissions comes from the Clean Air Act of 1970, as well as subsequent reauthorization, the newer versions of this legislation. For more details, see how it works, bureaucracy and legislation. Regulations are developed according to the notice and comment procedure. Before most regulations can take effect, they are published in the Federal Register and official journal that includes rules, proposed rules, and other types of government documents. Individuals and companies potentially affected by the regulation can then comment or respond to the agency that proposed it, either supporting or opposing the regulation or offering different versions for consideration. They can also appeal members of Congress Congress or to the president's staff for help in lobbying bureaucrats to revise the proposal. The agency then issues a final regulation that incorporates changes based on the comments. The final regulation is also published in the Federal Register and then put into effect. The process is time-consuming. For example, an ongoing effort of the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA, to develop regulations on the use of drone aircraft begin with congressional mandate issued in 2012. Current regulations limit the size and weight of drones that can be flown without registering with the agency. But the FAA is still developing rules to govern larger package delivery drones that must fly over populated areas. Many regulations can take even longer to craft from the beginning to the end. Here are the key terms. This is regarding bureaucracy, how it works, regulated gas emissions, this process of devising or modifying regulations is often political. Members of Congress and the president usually have strong opinions about how new regulations should look. And even when they don't, they may still get involved on behalf of a constituent or an interest group. Bureaucrats take account of these pressures for two reasons. Number one, the bureaucrats' policy-making power may derive from a statute that members of Congress could overturn. And number two, bureaucrats need congressional support to get larger budgets and to expand their agency's mission. Thus, despite bureaucrats' power to develop and implement policies, their agency's budget, appointed leaders, and overall missions are subject to elected officials' oversight. Federal regulations affect most aspects of everyday life. They influence the gas mileage of cars sold in the United States, the materials used to build roads, and the price of gasoline. They determine the amounts that doctors can charge for senior citizens for medical procedures, the hours that medical residents can work, the criteria used to determine who gets a heart, lung, or kidney transplant, and the allowable emissions from power plants. Regulations set the eligibility criteria for student loans, limit how the military can recruit on college campuses, determine who can get a home mortgage, and what the interest rate will be, and describe what constitutes equal funding for men's and women's college sports teams. Regulations also shape contribution limits and spending decision in political campaigns. Regulations are often controversial because they involve trade-offs between incompatible goals as well as decisions made under uncertain circumstances. For example, the regulations that guide the FDA approval process prioritize the goal of preventing harmful drugs from coming to market, As a result, patients sometimes cannot get access to experimental treatments because FDA approval has not been granted, even when those treatments are the patient's only remaining option. Advocates for patients have argued that people with dire prognosis should be allowed to use these treatments as potentially life-saving last resort. However, current FDA regulations prevent patients from doing so under very special circumstances. Here is this. Sometimes it comes off blurry. I'm so sorry. In the case of COVID-19, exceptions were made for the drugs hydroxychloroquine and remdesivir, both which had been tested for safety and approved for treatment of other diseases. However, follow-up studies found that hydroxychloroquine did not improve survival rates and also caused severe side effects for some patients, illustrating the risks associated with bypassing the FDA review process. Bringing expertise to policymaking. Bureaucrats are also an important source of new government policies. For example, Congress and the president give civilian and military personnel in the Department of Defense the job of revising military doctrines, broad directives on how our armed forces should go about accomplishing specific tasks, such as protecting civilian freighters from attacks by Somali pirates, deploying troops to rescue American civilians in hostile territory, or running military training operations in Africa. While military doctrines reflect input from members of Congress, the State Department, of the President and the President's appointees, and groups outside government, including lobbyists, think tanks, and defense contractors. They also reflect the preferences of the bureaucrats assigned to the task. Thus, in this case, Department president's appointees and groups outside government, including lobbyists, think tanks, and defense contractors. They also reflect the preferences of the bureaucrats assigned to the task. Thus, as in this case of regulations, when it comes to government policy, bureaucrats are not just implementers. They have significant influence on what government does and does not do. Delivering service. Some of the bureaucrats are the face of federal government, interacting directly with citizens to provide services and other benefits. People working in the Department of Agriculture assist farmers by processing crop loans and providing new advice on new technologies and techniques. Members of the Park Service operate the network of national parks and wilderness areas and transportation security. Administration staffs the security checkpoints at American airports. These and other jobs are a reminder of how intertwined the federal government is with the lives of ordinary Americans. We may like to think of the federal government as somewhat of something that exists only in Washington, D.C., but the reality is that bureaucrats are spread out across the country and are deeply involved with all elements of American society. Bureaucratic expertise and its consequences. Bureaucrats are experts even compared with most members of Congress or presidential appointees. The average bureaucrat is a specialist in a certain policy area, often holding an advanced degree with a good grasp of his or her agency missions. For example, people who hold scientific or management positions in the FDA usually know more about the benefits and risks of new drugs than people outside the agency do. A bureaucracy of experts is an important part of the state capacity. The knowledge, personnel, and institutions needed to effectively implement policies. It is an important check on elected officials, helping to ensure that government policies are effective and efficient. While having an expert bureaucracy seems like an obvious good idea, it creates a new problem for elected officials. Bureaucrats can bring expertise to their policy choices only if elected officials stop ordering bureaucrats around and instead allow them to act as they think best. But when elected officials allow such discretion, they risk losing control over the policy making process and having to live with policy choices that serve bureaucratic interests without satisfying the elected officials or their constituents. The problem of control principle and agents excuse me, the difficulty that elected officials and their staff face when trying to interpret or influence bureaucratic actions is the problem of control. A classic illustration of this situation is the principal agent game, which describes an interaction in which an individual or group, an agent, let me go ahead and zone in on that. If there is a weird light on the right, I am so sorry. Acts on behalf of another, the principal. In the federal government, the president and Congress are principals and bureaucrats are agents. An agent in the bureaucracy may prefer outcomes that the principal does not like. Moreover, because the agent is an expert at the task he or she has been given, the agent has additional knowledge and experience that are inaccessible to the principal. The conundrum for the principal then is this: giving the agent very specific orders prevents the agent from acting based on his or her expertise. But if the principal gives the agent the freedom to make decisions based on expertise, the principal has less control over the agent's actions. Suppose Congress and the president directed the FDA to shorten its drug approval process to approve new drugs or vaccines to fight COVID-19. FDA officials might have mandated a lengthy process based on their expert assessment of the best way to screen out harmful drugs. By giving orders that superseded the FDA's official screening process, elected officials would be sacrificing the valuable bureaucratic expertise behind the policy and risking the hasty approval of unsafe drugs. But if Congress and the president allowed FDA bureaucrats to devise their own procedures and regulations, there would be a chance that the FDA could use this freedom to pursue goals that have nothing to do with drug safety. For example, critics of the FDA's procedures have asserted that a drawn-out approval process favors large companies that are already have drugs on the market over smaller companies trying to get approval for drugs that would compete with existing products. The principal agent game can be framed in terms of citizens. Figure 12.1 shows that a majority of survey respondents agree that the federal government is typically inefficient and wasteful. Although the percentage agreeing with the assessments declined from its peak in 1994 until more recent years, when it again increased such options assessments declined from its peak in 1994 until more recent years when it again increased. Such opinions gave citizens a strong motivation to demand that elected officials control the bureaucracy to reduce waste and inefficiency, or as the quote from Ronald Reagan suggests, to prevent bureaucrats from an overly intruding into American society. One important consequence of the problem of control is the complexity of bureaucratic organizations and procedures. Despite bureaucrats' policy expertise, their decisions often appear to take too much time, rely on arbitrary judgments of what is important, and have unintended consequences to the point that actions designed to solve one problem may create worse ones. Examples include red tape, which refers to excessive or unnecessary complex regulations, and standard operating procedures, SOPs, which are the rules that lower level bureaucrats must follow regardless of whether they actually apply when implementing policies. The problem of control has existed throughout the history of federal government. It affects both the kinds of policies that bureaucrats implement and the structure of the federal bureaucracy, including the number of agencies and their missions, staff, and tasks. Moreover, elected officials use a variety of methods to solve the problems of control, including making it easier for people outside the government to learn about agency actions before they take effect. However, all these tactics are at best partial solutions to the problem of control. The trade-off between expertise and control remains. Here's regarding the red tape. Here's Americans, how they should feel, figure 12.1. Here's a couple of the quotes. How has the American bureaucracy grown? The evolution of America's federal bureaucracy was not steady or smooth. Most of its important developments occurred during three short periods: the late 1890s and early 1900s, the 1930s, and the 1960s. In all three, the driving force was a combination of citizens' demands for enhanced government services and government officials' desires to either respond to these demands or increase the size and scope of the federal government to be more in line with their own policy goals. The beginning of America's bureaucracy. From the beginning, or from the founding of the United States until the election of Andrew Jackson in 1828, the staff of the entire federal bureaucracy numbered at most in low thousands. The small size of the federal government during these years reflected Americans' deep suspicion of government, especially unelected officials, in the Declaration of Independence. In fact, one of the charges against George III was that he had erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. In these early years, there were only three executive departments: State Treasury and War, along with the Postmaster General, and executive branch offices were formed only when absolutely necessary. The small bureaucracy performed a very narrow range of tasks. It collected taxes on imports and exports and delivered the mail. The National Army consisted of a small corps of engineers and a few frontier patrols. The Attorney General was a private attorney who had the federal government as one of his clients. Members of Congress outnumbered civil servants in Washington, and the president had very little staff at all. The election of Andrew Jackson in 1828 brought the first large-scale use of the spoils system. People who had worked for Jackson's campaign were rewarded with new positions in the federal government, usually as local postmasters. The spoils system was extremely useful to party organizations as it gave them a powerful incentive with which to convince people to work for the party. And it gave them a powerful incentive with which to convince people to work for the party, and it was a particularly important tool for Jackson. His campaign organization was at the time the largest ever organized. The challenge facing the spoils system was ensuring that these government employees, who often lacked experience in their new fields, could actually carry out their jobs. The solution was to develop procedures that guided them on exactly what to do, even if they had no experience or training. These instructions became one of the earliest uses of standard operating procedures. They ensured that the government could function even if many employees had been hired in reward for political work rather than because of their qualifications. As America expanded, so did federal government, which saw an almost eightfold increase in the bureaucracy between 1860 and the beginning of Civil War in 1861. The growth did not reflect fundamental changes in what the government did. In fact, much of the increase came in areas such as the post office, which needed to serve a geographically larger nation, and of course to provide spoils for party workers in the form of government jobs. Even by the end of Civil War, the federal government still had very little involvement in the lives of ordinary Americans. State and local governments provided services such as education, public works, and welfare benefits if they were provided at all. The federal government's role in daily life was limited to mail delivery, the collections of import or export taxes, and few other sectors. I will zone in on the picture here so that you may read this. I don't know why it's blurry this morning. I am so sorry. And here's the key terms. Building a new American state, the Progressive Era. Political developments in the second half of the 19th century transformed America's bureaucracy. While the transformation began after the Civil War, the most significant changes occurred during the Progressive Era from 1890 to 1920. Many laws and executive actions increased the government's regulatory power during this period, including the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, the Federal Meat Inspection Act of 1906, expansion of the Interstate Commerce Commission, and various conservative measures. Now, the federal government had as indirect impact on several aspects of everyday life. When Americans bought food or other products, went to work, or traveled, the choices available to them were shaped by the actions of federal bureaucrats. These developments were matched by a fundamental change in the federal bureaucracy following the passage of the 1803 Pendleton Civil Service Act. This measure created the Federal Civil Service, in which the merit system, qualifications, not political connections, became the basis for hiring and promoting bureaucrats. In other words, new presidents took office. They could not replace government workers with their own campaign workers. Initially, only about 13,000 federal jobs acquired civil service protections, but subsequently, many additional positions were incorporated into the civil service. These reforms created bureaucracy in which people could build a career in government without having to fear being fired when a new president or Congress took office. In the modern era, virtually all full-time permanent government employees have civil service protections, although many individuals lack these protections because they work for a company that contracts services to the government or because they are senior political appointees. The New Deal, the Great Society, and the Reagan Revolution. Dramatic expansion of the federal bureaucracy occurred during the New Deal period. In the 1930s, during the mid-1960s, Great Society era, in both cases, the changes were driven by a combination of citizens' demands and the preference of elected officials who favored an increased role in government in society. These expansion trends were only marginally curtailed during the Reagan Revolution of the 1980s. The New Deal. The New Deal compromised government programs implemented during Franklin Roosevelt's first term as president in the 1930s. These programs were partly a response to the Great Depression and the inability of local governments and private charities to provide adequate support to Americans during the economic crisis. Many advocates of the New Deal also favored an expanded role for government in American society, regardless of the immediate need for intervention. Roosevelt's programs included reforms to the financial industry as well as efforts to help people directly, including the stimulation of employment and economic growth and the formation of labor unions. The Social Security Act, the first federally funded pension program for all Americans, was also passed as part of the New Deal. These reforms resulted in a vast increase in the size of and responsibilities for bureaucracy, as well as a large transfer of power to bureaucrats and to the president. Before the New Deal, the federal government influenced citizens' choices through activities such as regarding industries and workplace conditions. Afterward, it took on the role of directly delivering a wide range of benefits and services to its citizens. From jobs to electricity, it also increased regulations on many industries, including those in the banking and financial sectors. Expansion of federal government and the subsequent delegation of power to bureaucrats and to the president were controversial changes. Many Republicans opposed New Deal reforms because they believed that the federal government could not deliver services efficiently and that an expanded federal bureaucracy would create a modern spoils system. Many Southerners worried that the federal government's increased involvement in everyday life would endanger the system of racial segregation in Southern states. Even so, Democratic supporters of the New Deal, cited by public supporter, carried the day. The Great Society. I'll sign in so it can. The Great Society was a series of federal programs enacted during Lyndon Johnson's 1963-1969 that further expanded the size of capacity and activities of bureaucracy. Johnson proposed and Congress passed programs that funded bilingual education, loans, and grants for college students, special education, preschools, construction of elementary and secondary schools, mass transit programs in many cities, healthcare for seniors and poor people, job training, and
urban renewal, enhanced voting rights and civil rights for minorities, environmental protection, funding for the arts and cultural activities, and space exploration. The Great Society programs had mixed success. Voting rights and civil rights reforms ended the separate but equal system of social order in the southern states and dramatically increased political participation by African Americans. At the same time, many anti poverty programs were dismal failures. During the 1960s and 1970s, poverty rates among most groups remained relatively constant, and other indicators, such as the rate of teen pregnancy, actually increased. In retrospect, the people who designed and implemented these programs did not realize the complexities of the problems they were trying to address. Despite these shortcomings, the expansion of the federal government during the New Deal and Great Society has remained in place well into the 21st century. The Reagan Revolution and afterward. The election of Ronald Reagan to the presidency in 1980, along with the Republican takeover of the Senate and Republican gains in the House of Representatives, created an opportunity for conservatives to roll back the size and scope of the federal government. These efforts were largely unsuccessful in the years since Reagan. Members of Congress and presidents from both parties have fought for large expansions in government policy. For example, while Democrat Barack Obama's administration issued many new environmental regulations and profoundly changed the American healthcare system, these changes are not too different in magnitude from the reforms championed by Republican George W. Bush, including education policies that increased federal control over local school districts, new drug financing benefits for seniors, and changes to financial regulations that increased financial reporting requirements for corporations. After 4 years in office, the Trump administration had little success in cutting overall federal spending or in reducing the size of specific agencies. For example, the administration initially proposed a 1/3 cut in the budget of the State Department for fiscal year 2018, only to ultimately accept a congressional budget that kept levels of constant. The modern federal bureaucracy. The size and scope of modern federal bureaucracy reflects the expansion of the federal government over the last half century, and its increased role in citizens' lives. The bureaucracy structure also reflects ongoing attempts by presidents, members of Congress, and others to control bureaucratic actions in line with their policy goals. Nuts and Bolts 12.3 or 12.1, I'm so sorry, getting used to my glasses, guys, shows the structure that the executive branch of the federal government, as discussed in Chapter 11, the Executive Office of the President, EOP, contains organizations that support the president and implement presidential policy initiatives. Individuals working in these organizations aim to ensure that agents act appropriately to implement the president's principles, priorities, and preferences. Among its many offices, the EOP contains the Office of Management and Budget, which prepares the president's annual budget proposal to Congress and monitors government spending as well as the development of new regulations. Below the EOPs are the 15 executive departments, from the Department of Agriculture to the Department of Veterans Affairs. The heads of these 15 organizations, plus others added by presidential order, make up the president's cabinet. One thing to remember, while the diagram places the EOP above the cabinet departments and all other government
agencies, the president's authority to direct agency decisions is not absolute, as it is limited by state regulations and the Constitution, as well as by the pressure of business and a lack of information. These limits are discussed later in this chapter, as well as in chapter 11. Each executive department contains many smaller, sometimes diverse organizations. For example, Nuts and Bolts 12.2 shows the organizational chart for the Department of Agriculture. In addition to executive departments, the government contains a group of agencies, commissions, and government corporations that are called independent agencies. To highlight that they are not part of an executive department, most of these agencies carry out specialized functions regulating a particular activity. These are called independent regulatory agencies, or carrying out in a narrow area. Here is the key terms. This is the nuts and bolts. I hope you can read that. Here's 12.2, the structure of Department of Agriculture. The Federal Reserve System, for example, manages the money supply, banking system, and interest rates, while the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, directs aviation research and space exploration. Nuts and Bolts 12.1 includes only some noteworthy agencies. There are many more. There are two important lessons to draw from these charts. First, federal government handles an enormous range of functions. Second, the division of activities among executive departments and independent agencies does not always have an obvious logic. Why, for example, does the Department of Agriculture administer rural utilities programs and the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, SNAP, formerly known as food stamps? Similarly, it is not always clear why certain tasks are handled by an independent agency while others fall within the scope of an executive department. Why is the Food and Drug Administration, FDA, an independent agency rather than part of the Department of Commerce? And why is the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA, located within the Department of Transportation rather than being independent? Part of the difference between independent agencies and the organizations contained within executive departments has to do with the president's ability to control these organizations' activities. Organizations that fall within an executive department, such as the FAA or the Federal Highway Administration, FHA, both within the Department of Transportation, can be subject to presidential control to some extent through his or her appointees. In contrast, independent agencies are often designed to have more freedom from oversight and control by President and Congress. For example, governors of the Federal Reserve, though nominated by the President and confirmed by the Senate, serve for 14 years, outlasting the administration that nominated them. Outside the nomination and confirmation process, the President and Congress have very little control over the Federal Reserve's policies. The organization is self-financing, and its governors can be removed from office only if Congress impeaches them. These kinds of details about the hiring and firing of bureaucrats and the location of agencies, I hate that. Federal Reserve policies, this organization of self-financing, and its governors can be removed only if Congress impeaches them. These kinds of details about the hiring and firing of bureaucrats and the location of agencies
in the structure of federal government matters because they determine the amount of political control that other parts of the government can exercise over an agency, as well as which individuals, the president or members of Congress, get exercise this power. Let me go ahead and show you the employment cabinet. I'm so sorry, guys. I usually am on top of the ball. Okay. The size of the federal government. The federal government employs millions of people. Table 12.1 shows the number of employees in each executive department. Millions of additional people work for the government as members of the armed forces, as employees of the Postal Service, as employees of civilian companies that contract with the government, or as recipients of federal grant money. The What Do You Fact Say feature in this chapter shows the number of civilian federal employees from 1961 to 2020. Clearly, the federal workforce has steadily increased over time, although it has declined from its peak in the 1990s and remained steady in recent years. Some observers argue that growth in employment was driven by the fact that bureaucrats are budget maximizers who never pass up a chance to increase the size of their organization regardless of whether increase is worthwhile. Of course, the fact that federal government or federal employment has remained steady in recent years suggests that something besides the budget maximization is at work. The best explanation for the overall size of the federal government is the size of America itself. Nearly 330 million people spread out over an area more than twice the size of the European Union. Combined with America's position as the most powerful nation in the world, with the largest military and increased costs associated with some government services such as healthcare, those who blame bureaucrats for the increasing size of the federal government miss some important points. First, the increase in total federal spending masks the fact that many agencies see their budgets shrink. Particularly in recent administrations, one of the principal missions of presidential appointees, both in agencies and in the EOP, has been scrutinized budget requests with an eye to cutting spending as much as possible. And in most years, some government agencies are eliminated. In fact, most of the executive department head counts table and table 12.1 have grown smaller in recent editions of this text. Public opinion data also provide an explanation for the overall growth within the government. The American public's demands for services, despite complaints about the federal bureaucracy, polls find little evidence of demands for less government. When the Pew Research Center asked people in 2019 to name programs that should have their spending cut as a way of reducing the budget deficit, the only program that was named by more than a quarter of responding was foreign economic aid. Far fewer people favored cuts in the programs that accounts for most federal spending: defense, healthcare, and Social Security. In other words, while in the abstract, Americans might want a smaller government that is less involved in everyday life, they do not support the large-scale budget cuts that would be necessary to achieve this goal. The public's desire for more government services is often encouraged by elected officials who create new government programs and expand existing ones as a way of building support and improving their chances of re-election. The human face of the bureaucracy. The term bureaucrat applies to an array of people with different qualifications and job descriptions. The federal government includes so many different kinds of jobs that, because of the vast array of services it provides. See Figure 12.2. Although citizens and politicians often complain about federal bureaucrats' efficiency or motivations, surveys show that many employees in these positions have strong interest in public service or the implementation of good public policy. In fact, these motivations are often strong enough that scholars such as James L. Perry have argued against attempts to motivate federal workers with monetary incentives. Bureaucrats who worked hard because they feel it is the right thing to do may resent incentive schemes that presumed they are lazy or only interested in money. Here's Figure 12.2. I'm so sorry. Civil service regulations. Most jobs in the federal bureaucracy are subject to civil service regulation. The current civil service system sets out job descriptions and pay ranges for all federal jobs. The system also establishes tests that determine who is hired for low-level clerical and secretarial positions. People with less than a college degree are generally eligible for entry-level jobs. And as in the private sector, a college degree or an advanced degree and work experience qualify an individual for higher level positions. Federal salaries are supposed to be comparable to what people earn in similar private sector positions, and salaries are somewhat higher for federal employees who work in areas with high cost of living. Civil service regulations provide job security after 3 years of satisfactory performance. Employees cannot be fired except for cause, meaning that the firing agency must cite a reason. Civil service regulations set out the multi-step procedure for firing someone, beginning with low performance evaluations, then warning letters given to the employee, followed by a lengthy appeals process before a firing takes place. It is hard to get exact data, but I'm so sorry, I got lost. Civil service for cause of, meaning the firing, civil service. I'm only human, guys. Followed by, okay, it is hard to get the exact data, but most estimates are that about 10,000 federal employees are fired every year out of a total workforce of over 2 million. A subpar performer may be assigned other duties, transferred to another office, or even given nothing to do in the hope that the person will leave voluntarily out of boredom or embarrassment. Excuse me. Civil service regulations are extraordinarily cumbersome. The hiring criteria remove managers' discretion to hire someone who would do an excellent job but lacks the education or work experience that the regulations specify as necessary for the position. The firing requirements make it difficult to remove poor performers. The salary and promotion restrictions create problems with rewarding excellent performance or promoting the best employees rather than those with the most seniority. Why do these requirements exist? The aim of civil service regulations was to separate politics from policy. The mechanism for achieving this goal was a set of rules that made it hard for elected officials to control the hiring and firing of government employees to further their own political goals. In effect, even though civil service regulations have drawbacks, they also provide this very important benefit. For example, without civil service protections, members of Congress might pressure employees in the Office of Personnel Management to increase pensions for retiring federal workers in the
representatives' constituencies. Although loyalty to the president is a widely accepted criterion for hiring agency heads and other presidential appointees, professionals with permanent civil service positions are supposed to be hired on the basis of their qualifications, not their political beliefs. Political appointees and senior executive service. Not every federal employee is a member of the civil service. About 3,000 senior positions in the executive branch, such as the leaders of executive departments and independent agencies like NASA, as well as members of the EOP, are not subject to civil service regulations. The president appoints individuals to these positions, and in some cases, the Senate must confirm them. The majority of a president's appointees act as his or her eyes, ears, and hands throughout the executive branch. They hold positions of power within government agencies, serving as secretaries of executive branch. They hold positions of power within the government agencies, serving as secretaries of executive departments, agency heads, or senior deputies. Their jobs involved finding out what the president wants when their agency and ordering or persuading their subordinates to implement presidential directives. In many agencies, people in the top positions are members of Senior Executive Services, SES, who are also exempt from civil service restrictions. As of 2020, there are about 8,000 SES members, mostly career government employees, who held relatively high-level agency positions before moving to the SES. This change of employment status cost them their civil service protections, but allows them to apply for senior leadership positions in the bureaucracy. Some political appointees are also given SES positions, although most do not have the experience or expertise held by career bureaucrats who typically move to the SES. The president's ability to appoint bureaucrats in many different agencies help him or her control the bureaucracy. By selecting people who are loyal or like-minded, the president can attempt to control the actions of lower level bureaucrats and implement his or her policy agenda. The SES also provides civil servants and an incentive to do their jobs well, as good performance in an agency position can help build a career that might allow them to transfer to the SES. Limits on political activity. Legislation places limits on the political activities that federal employees can undertake. The Hatch Act, enacted in 1939 and amended in 1940, prohibit federal employees from engaging in organized political activities. Employees could vote and contribute to candidates, but could not work for candidates or for political parties. These restrictions were modified in the 1993 Federal Employees Political Activities Act, which allow federal employees to participate in wider range of political activities, including fundraising and serving as an officer of a political party. Senior members of the President's White House staff and political appointees are exempt from most of these restrictions, although they cannot use government resources for political activities. Controlling the bureaucracy. As the expert implementers of legislation and presidential directives, bureaucrats hold significant power to influence government policy. This situation creates the problem of control illustrated by the principal agent game. As we discussed earlier, elected officials must figure out how to reap the benefits of bureaucratic expertise without simply giving bureaucrats free rein to do whatever they want. One strategy is to take away the discretion and give bureaucrats simple, direct orders. For example, from 1996 to 2015, a law passed by Congress forbade the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, from conducting research that would advocate or promote gun control, which was interpreted by the CDC as limiting all gun-related research by agency scientists or by outside researchers who received agency funds. The ban was repealed after a series of mass shootings in 2013, although to this day the CDC conducts very little gun-related research. The problem with eliminating bureaucrats' discretion in this way is that it limits the positive influence of their expertise. Particularly, new policies are being developed. Taking away bureaucratic discretion is costly for legislators or presidential appointees because it forces them to work out the policy details themselves, and it may produce less effective policies than those constructed by bureaucrats with specialized knowledge. Moreover, preventing bureaucrats from using their judgment makes it impossible for them to craft policies that take into account new developments or unforeseen circumstances. For all these reasons, elected officials must find other ways to reduce or eliminate bureaucratic drift. That is, bureaucrats' pursuit of their own goals rather than their assignments from office holders or appointees. While still reaping the benefits of bureaucratic expertise, this section describes two common strategies: changing the way agencies are organized and staffed, and using standardized procedures for monitoring agency actions. See Take the Stand feature. Agency organization. Political scientists have shown how agencies can be organized to minimize bureaucratic drift, specifically when an agency is set up or given new responsibilities. The officials who initiated the change don't simply tell the new agency what to do. To ensure that the agency pursues the policies officials want, they also determine where the agency is located within the federal government structure and who runs it. Here is this. Why should I care? Here's this. I don't know why it's not focusing. I'm so sorry. I don't know what the deal is today with my camera. Some days it works good, some days it does not. Here is the political. I will kind of scroll down. Political control over the bureaucracy beneficial. Okay. These efforts may occur solely within Congress, may involve both Congress and the president, or may be arranged by presidential actions. For example, one of the Obama administration's responses in the 2008 financial crisis was to form a new agency, the Consumer Financial Protection Agency Bureau, the CFPB, which would help enforce new bank regulations and investigate consumer complaints about financial firms. However, Republican senators opposed Obama's initial nominees to run the agency. Elizabeth Warren, believing she would encourage her subordinates to be excessively pro-consumer. Similarly, in 2017, President Trump appointed Michael Mulvaney, a former Republican congressman and the head of the Office of Management and Budget and the Chief of Staff in the Trump administration, who run the agency, even though Mulvaney was a longtime opponent of CFPB, who, as a member of Congress, had sought to abolish the agency. Both Trump and Obama's appointees were intended to shape agency operations by appointing an individual who was expected to act in line with the then president's preferences. Monitoring. One of the most important ways elected officials prevent bureaucratic drift is by keeping an eye on what bureaucrats are doing or planning to do. Information gathering by members of Congress about bureaucratic actions is termed oversight. Congressional committees often hold hearings to question agencies' heads, secretaries of executive departments, or senior agency staff. Similarly, one responsibility of presidential appointees is to monitor how low-level bureaucrats are responding to presidential directives. However, appointees may be unable to fulfill this role because they are chosen for their loyalty to the president. They may lack the experience needed to fully understand what bureaucrats in their agency are doing. Moreover, given that appointees typically hold their position for only a year or two, they have little time to learn the details of agency operations. Advance warning. Many of Congress, members of Congress, don't know what's wrong with me today, guys. Sorry. Members of the Congress, the president, and his or her staff gain advanced knowledge of planned bureaucratic actions through the notice and comment procedure described earlier, which requires bureaucrats to disclose proposed regulation before they take effect. This delay gives opponents the opportunity to register complaints with their congressional representatives, and it allows these legislators time either to pressure the agency to revise the regulation or even enact another law undoing or modifying the agency action. Members of Congress also pressure bureaucrats to release memos, working drafts, and other documents as ways of keeping track of bureaucrats are doing. For example, in 2020, members of the Inspector of General Steve Linick, the concern was that Linick was fired because he was investigating complaints that the Secretary of State Mike Pompeo had used State Department staff to run personal errands. Here's the oversight. Now, why it's... And I'm so sorry, guys. I don't know. There we go. Sometimes it focuses, sometimes it does not. Investigations, police patrols, and fire alarms. Congress legislative staffs. I'm so sorry. Congress, police patrols, and fire alarms. Congress legislative staff or presidential appointees may initiate investigations of government programs or offices to scrutinize the organizations, their expenditures, and their activities. There are two types of investigation: police patrol oversight and fire alarm oversight. Ideally, every agency would be investigated on a consistent basis. With agencies that have large budgets or carry out important functions being investigated more frequently, these investigations may involve fact-finding, trips to local offices, interviews with senior personnel, audits of agency accounts, and calls to the agency to see how it responds to citizens' requests. The method of investigation is called police patrol oversight. Think of a police officer walking his or her beat, rattling doors to see if they were locked, checking out broken windows, and looking down alleys for suspicious behavior. The disadvantage of police patrol oversight is that it is costly in terms of money and staffed time. Moreover, these investigations often find that agencies are doing what they should be doing. Because of these problems, Congress and the President often follow a different strategy. Rather than initiating investigations, they wait until they receive a complaint about the bureaucratic actions and then focus investigative efforts on those cases, a practice labeled fire alarm oversight. The so-called fire alarm oversight
that sets off an investigation can take many different forms. Constituents may let their congressional representatives or their staff know of a problem with the bureaucracy. Similarly, lobbyists, corporate executives, and ordinary citizens often contact the president and his or her staff with complaints. Newspaper reporters and internet bloggers also provide information about what bureaucrats are doing. In addition, some agencies have advisory committees that not only help make agency decisions, but also keep Congress and the president informed about their agency's actions. Such fire alarm communications tell Congress and the president where to focus their efforts to monitor the bureaucracy, removing the need to try to oversee the entire government at once. Here are the terms. Correcting violations. When the president or members of Congress find a case of bureaucratic drift, they can choose from the many tactics to bring a wayward agency into line. Legislation or an executive order can send a clear directive to an agency or remove its discretion. Tasks and programs can be moved to an agency more closely aligned with elected officials. Goals, political appointees at an agency can be replaced and agencies can be reorganized. A significant difficulty in dealing with bureaucratic drift is disagreement between members of Congress and the president about whether an agency is doing the right thing. Regardless of whether it is following its original orders, many strategies for influencing an agency's behavior require joint action by the president and congressional majorities. Without presidential support, members of Congress need a 2/3 majority to impose corrections. Without congressional support, the president can only threaten to cut an agency's proposed budget, change its home within the federal bureaucracy, or establish a new agency to do what the errant agency refuses to do. Actually carrying out these threats requires congressional approval. As a result, disagreements between the president and Congress can give an agency significant freedom as long as it retains the support of at least one branch of government. An agency may also be able to fend off elected officials' attempts to take political control of it. Has a reputation for expertise. For example, one reason that attempts to pass legislation forcing the FDA to alter its drug approval process have had little success is that the FDA's process is thought to have worked mostly as intended, approving new drugs that are safe and effective and keeping ineffective or unsafe drugs off the market. At the same time, the FDA has responded to pressure from Congress and the president to revise some rules on its own. Finally, agencies can sometimes combat attempts to control their behavior by appealing to groups that benefit the agency's actions. For example, since the 1980s, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, the OSHA, has resisted attempts by Republican presidents and Republican members of Congress to eliminate the agency or limit its operations. One element of its strategy has been to build strong ties to labor unions. As a result, OSHA is much more likely to receive complaints about workplace safety from companies with strong unions. This strategy has also involved building cooperative arrangements with large companies to prevent workplace accidents, an approach that only protects workers but also can save companies a lot of money over the long term. Moreover, when OSHA levies fines against companies that violate safety regulations, the fines are generally much less
than the maximum fines that would be allowed by law. As a result, when proposals to limit to or eliminate OSHA are debated in Congress, members hear from unions as well as many large corporations in support of keeping agencies in place. Over time, this strategy has generated support for the agency from congressional Democrats to Republicans. The consequences of control. Elected officials competing desires to both control what bureaucrats do and tap their expertise explain many of the seemingly dysfunctional aspects of the bureaucracy. Part of the problem is the nature of the tasks given to bureaucrats. Even when members of Congress and the president agree on which problems deserve attention, bureaucrats face much harder task of translating these goals into concrete policies. Given the magnitude of this job, it is no surprise that even the best efforts of government agencies do not always succeed. Most important, the use of standard operating procedures is rooted partly in the complexity of bureaucrats' tasks, but also in the desire of agency heads and elected officials to control the actions of lower level staff. In some disaster relief efforts, government agencies have found that preset plans and procedures worked against the need to respond quickly to alleviate human suffering, and while the FDA's drug approval process succeeds for the most part in preventing harmful drugs from
coming into market. The delays imposed by the process do prevent some patients from receiving life-saving treatments. However, in all these cases, the decisions do not reflect incompetence or malice. Rules and procedures are needed in any organization to ensure that decisions are fair and reflect the goals of the organization. Yet it is impossible to find procedures that will work well in all cases, particularly for the kinds of policy decisions bureaucrats make. Unpacking the conflict. Considering all that we've discussed in this chapter, let's return to President Trump's often contentious relationship with members of federal bureaucracy. Were bureaucrats really obstructing the Trump agenda, or were they just doing their jobs? How do elected officials control bureaucracy of experts in the midst of a pandemic or more routine times? A deeper look shows that some of the time conflicts between President Trump and the bureaucratic officials reflected real disagreements in the case counting deaths from COVID-19. For example, it is not hard to see why the Trump or the politically minded people around him preferred a definition that minimized casualties. However, the fact that many bureaucrats are policy experts suggest an alternative explanation of their preference for a different accounting scheme. Rather than trying to embarrass Trump or ensure his defeat, bureaucrats may have been acting from expertise, working to account for the pandemic in a way that facilitated an effective environmental. Rather than trying to embarrass Trump or ensure his defeat, bureaucrats may have been acting from expertise, working to account for the pandemic in a way that facilitated an effective governmental response. Bureaucratic expertise and the resulting problem of control also explain the cumbersome procedures for hiring, firing, and decision-making that are feature of operations in many government agencies. Sometimes bureaucrats simply make mistakes choosing the wrong policy because they, and in some cases, all the people involved lack information about the tasks they were given. Bureaucrats may drag their feet when they oppose their tasks on policy grounds, but in many cases, cumbersome
procedures are the result of a fundamental trade-off faced by elected officials between wanting to exercise control over the bureaucracy and wanting to ensure that changes in policy produce their influence effect. Put another way, conflict over public policy often translate into conflicting ideas about what bureaucrats should do, resulting in complex, often contradictory mandates and directions imposed on bureaucrats. In this way, politics shapes virtually all aspects of the bureaucracy and of the choices bureaucrats make, even in the place where it is hard to discern political motivations. That is the end of chapter 12. I am so sorry it took so long, guys.